Let's move to what is the big story of this week and last week and probably next week too, and that's the European Union's financial problems. The EU is in a survival crisis, according to its president, that's Herman Van Rompuy. Rumpy to you and me. The debt problems of the Eurozone once again threaten the stability of that Eurozone member bloc. Now, European finance ministers are meeting in Brussels today to review the crisis. It isn't exactly sure how they're going to go or what they're going to do, and it isn't just a crisis for Eurozone countries, is it, Anita?
No, you're absolutely right. The problems caused by the European debt crisis have returned, as Andrew says, and they really could have a very serious impact right here in the UK. Why? Well, Ireland is heavily in the red. Total debt expected to rise to almost 100% of Ireland's GDP this year. As speculation mounts that it could default on its debts, Ireland is under a huge amount of pressure to accept a bailout. Although the UK isn't in the Eurozone, any bailout could be part-funded, at least, by the British taxpayer. Britain's already contributed about £6 billion to an emergency fund, which Ireland could call upon if it needs to. Ireland is also the UK's biggest European trading partner. This perhaps is one of the most important aspects. British exports to Ireland bring in about £24 billion a year. And British banks, let's not forget them, they're also very heavily exposed. Let's take RBS, for example. 84% owned by the British taxpayer, and it has a £4.3 billion exposure to Irish debt. And this crisis could also have political implications too. France and Germany, they want to amend the Lisbon Treaty to prevent the kind of turmoil seen after Greece defaulted on its debts. David Cameron says he's willing to accept changes, but it's causing him a huge headache coming from his Eurosceptic backbenchers. And what's more, Ireland's also making radical cuts to public spending, just like the rest of the UK. George Osborne has a lot riding on the success of Ireland's austerity measures. Well, let's find out now what the city makes of this, and we always turn to David Buick at times like this, market analyst at BGC Partners. You know, markets cope with bad news, they cope with good news, but they just can't stand indecision, and that seems to be the hallmark of what's going on at the moment.
Hello, Anita. Yes, we've got it in spades, I'm afraid. It's the lack of leadership from the EU and the intransigence, I suppose, from Taoiseach and also the Finance Minister, Brian Lenihan, to actually accept that they have to do something about this. We all accept that they're telling the truth, that they are fully financed and fully up to snuff by the middle of next year, but that's not the issue. The issue is 2012, 2013, and it's the Irish banks that have caused this unbelievable problem. They are probably in for about 70 billion euros. And people are taking money away from their deposit accounts. They are not having any success in raising money.
Right.
The value of their assets are decreasing as well, so it's a very serious problem.
David, that's an absolutely eye-watering amount. So, I mean, are you saying that the banks, the Irish banks, could run out of money before the Irish government does?
Yes, I am. And I think that is the issue. The fact remains is this NAMA, this cesspit of toxic debt, which sometime down the line, 5, 6 years from now, could well have some serious value, but we can't wait until then. And the fact remains is that the Irish banks are absolutely in the most terrible problems. The one thing that I think that would sort this out is, of course, if Brian Cowen and Brian Lenihan were to accept that sovereignty has to be swept aside, and also any pride, and providing they can negotiate something over a protracted period of time with the EU and the ECB, allowing the Irish economy to get itself together again. And the one thing it can't have and it mustn't do is agree to any increase in the 12.5% corporation tax. Ireland's been very clever over the years in persuading foreign companies to come to Ireland, manufacture things and export them, and has been hugely successful at it. It needs growth, Ireland.
David, I was going to say thank you, but it is a terrifying picture. Thank you very much, and nonetheless, Andrew.
Thanks, Anita. Let's continue with this story. Nigel Farage is still with us, and we're joined also by the Conservative Chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, Richard Ottaway. Welcome to the Daily Politics. Now, we weren't involved in bailing out the Greeks. Why are we involved in bailing out the Irish?
Well, because it's a decision that was made by the last government that we would be part of the stabilisation mechanism which
Alistair Darling agreed to
which
this.
was signed by Alistair Darling, and we are bound by it. So it's a decision of the last government, which I'm afraid we're stuck with.
Couldn't the coalition government have renegotiated that commitment?
I don't think they could. Once the ink's dry, that is it. It would have meant something far more fundamental if we'd actually renegotiated it.
Now, as I understand it, are we up for more than just giving guarantees? If there is a bailout, essentially to the Irish banks, as David Buick was saying this, that's where the real problem is. It's not Irish sovereign debt, it's the balance sheets and the fact that no one has any faith in the Irish debts. If Europe moves in to bail them out in some way, are we actually having to write a cheque, or do we just give guarantees for the money that will go in?
Well, first of all, it's not yet clear.
No, I'm saying if it does.
If it does, it's a loan. So we write a cheque, but we will eventually get repaid.
We hope.
We hope, yes. If the country, the idea is to stop Ireland going bust, so hopefully we would get repaid.
We may have to give guarantees too, as I understand it, on other, if this other stability fund comes in.
Your knowledge of the mechanism is greater than mine. As I understand it, it would effectively mean loans rather than guarantees.
Well, there are two kinds of stability funds, in a sense. There is the European Commission one, but there's another one that was set up recently.
And the difference between them is quite important, because the facility, which we're not part of, needs unanimous voting, whereas the mechanism, which we are part of, is majority voting.
Isn't it true that even if we lived in a UKIP Britain, even if we were a sovereign, independent, non-EU member nation, we would want to go and help out the Irish because the Irish economy is so important to us?
Possibly. But I mean, I think the problem with all of this is we could just be pouring good money after bad. We've got countries like Ireland and countries like Greece that should never have joined the euro in the first place. And the question that I keep asking Barroso and Van Rompuy is, what is Plan B? Is there anything in place to allow these countries to get their national currencies back? Because it's pretty clear to me that even if we do shore up the Irish banks, even if we do, for the moment, allow the Greeks to go and borrow more money on the markets, if they're stuck inside a currency to which they're hopelessly unsuited, they'll be coming back to us again in 2 or 3 years' time and asking for more money. So I would say that British money should be dependent upon there being a plan that Ireland can refloat its own currency at some time in the not-too-distant future.
You mean leave the euro?
Yes, absolutely.
You leave the Eurozone? What do you say to that?
I mean, there is a plan B, and the rules were drawn up when they entered into the euro. And if they kept to those rules about the levels of the size of the deficit, then you wouldn't have Nigel's call for a plan B, because it's already there.
But these are very different economies. I mean, just as when the Tories took us into the ERM, we saw that Britain couldn't survive with Germany in a fixed parity system. And I'm arguing that longer term, Ireland and Greece do not fit inside this model, and we should be considering the alternatives.
Well, I think you may well be right, but this vindicates the Conservative Party's decision not to go into the euro back in '97.
Well, you both agreed on that.
Absolutely, yeah. That's one thing we will agree on.
But isn't the problem, coming back to Ireland's situation, and this is true for Portugal and to some extent Spain and certainly Greece too, is that one of the arguments for the euro was it would provide discipline. They would be linked to German-style monetary policy and a German-style independent European bank, a Bundesbank for the Eurozone. And instead of providing discipline, it allowed countries that had dodgy currencies, like the Greeks, to actually go and borrow in euros at very low interest rates to their heart's content. Instead of discipline, it turned out to be kids in the candy store.
I mean, Andrew, you're absolutely right, but it was the Germans and the French who led the charge on not complying with the rules. They knew what the rules were. They wanted their budgets to grow, their deficits to grow, and of course they couldn't then argue when Greece and Ireland and Portugal went down the same road.
Well, that's why Van Rompuy now is proposing this massive power grab, which would be that they'll set the rules in the future, and anybody that breaches them will have their voting rights suspended. And so we're heading directly towards a form of real economic government.
The chances are that you said that there has to be a plan to do it. But if there is a bailout of Ireland, and Richard is right, we don't know yet, but the Irish are sure under a terrible amount of pressure at the moment to accept. It's very interesting that someone who's bankrupt has actually been having to be forced to be bailed out. Normally, the bankrupt is...
We'd all like that.
I should also just remember to say that it shows you what a state the country's in if Gerry Adams is the white knight to save it. There is surely there will be conditions. If Ireland is bailed out, the IMF will be involved, the European Commission will be involved, and the structural, the stability fund that was set up will be involved. They will all impose tough conditions on Ireland.
Yes, that's right. But if they're still stuck inside a currency where they need competitive devaluation, then they're having to take the pain without any of the benefit of devaluation.
That's why all the pain
what
falls on fiscal policy.
Yeah, and that's, if the IMF was going in to shore up a country, it would provide money and loans, but it would also engineer a competitive devaluation.
How big a risk do you think there is that the euro, I don't want to ask you if the euro will blow apart, because I think the French and the Germans have got so much capital to keep it together, but will some countries leave, as Nigel's hinting? Will some of the peripheral nations leave the euro?
I think Nigel's absolutely right, that when behind this is inevitably some sort of political and economic union far stronger than we got at the moment. And some countries may find this hard to live with. We decided a long time ago we couldn't live with it, but others, particularly Ireland, Portugal, possibly even Italy, may find that this is something they don't want to be part of, and it will become a sort of Northern European Eurozone.
Well, whatever happens, we will be affected, because our two biggest banks, Lloyds and the Royal Bank of Scotland, both have huge loans out to the Irish banks. Gentlemen, I think we'll be discussing this all week, but I thank you for getting us off on such an informed way. Richard, thanks for joining us.